estate to the master. Now, the problem at the master's office is that they have a backlog. That's issue number one. Issue number two is, what happens is, they have a high turnover of staff. So what happens, there seems to be a problem in the South African government at this point in time, where the person knows he's going to get fired, right? He's going to lose his job. So he does no work. He says, the guy who's going to come next, he can do this. So and the guy who comes next, he's like, I don't know what's happening. I can't do anything, because he blames the guy who was before him. And this seems to, I know it's a joke, but it's not a joke at the same time. And this is the problem. This is the reason why many of the estates take longer than a year. It should wind up in about 6 months. I think 6 months is reasonable, but that's not what's happening at the moment. All right? One is so once the estate is reported, there's a threshold. So either the value of your estate is either going to be above 250,000 rand or below 250,000 rand. If it is below 250,000 rand, then the master will issue you something called letters of authority, right? Which pretty much letters of administration. Letters of authority or letters of administration. Yeah, letters of administration essentially allow you to wind up the estate very quickly. Right? You don't have to provide security. A lot of things you don't have to provide. It's very easy. But if the estate is worth more than 250,000 rand, then you need what is known as letters of executorship. And then the matter does become a little bit more complicated. Alright. There's also notices that requires for creditors. In other words, if you owe people, you need to notify in the government gazette and in the local newspaper for a period of time. And then also, before the final distribution, the executor must send the calculated percentage to each heir, before. Now, one of the questions that is asked usually is, what is an estate? What does it consist of exactly? And very easily, it consists of an executor, which is responsible essentially. An executor takes your place. When you are no longer there, the executor assumes your position as owner of all of your estate or your assets. That's ultimately what the executor is. And his duty is to make sure that he implements your will. Your will. So whatever your will says, the executor must do that. That's his job. The beneficiary, those are the people that benefit from that will, or rather from that estate. That's the beneficiary. They benefit from the estate in one way or another. Then you have the legatee. That would be the person who gets the wasiya. Right? So whatever if you're giving something specific to someone, you'll be a legatee. And then the last person will be the heir. The heir is your faraid, essentially. That is the person that is related to you through nasab, in other words, through blood. Right? How do we report an estate? This is very simple. It's been made simple now, more simple. So before you had to obviously gather all the documents that you required, right? The death reporting, the death notice, you needed to gather you need to fill out the next of kin affidavit and complete the death notice and all of these things. Now, you still have to do this. But now, what the master's office has done in step 2 is before you needed to deliver this bundle of documents to the master personally. Now, you can do it online. So it's become a lot simpler, but also at the same time stricter. So your documents need to really be in order. Now, one of the issues I've had in the past was that I've uploaded the documents to the master, but there's an issue on the marriage certificate, or rather on the marriage certificate. So the marriage certificate is supposed to say, the death certificate. So on the death certificate, it's supposed to say that the person was widowed, but instead it said married, and she hadn't been married for 40 years. Her husband had passed away 40 years ago. So what happened after that was, when we uploaded the death certificate, the system automatically flagged that they wanted now a marriage certificate. But there is no marriage certificate, right? Because she'd been widowed for 40 years. So then what happened was, it lengthened the process by another 6 months, because that's how long it takes for Pretoria to send a new death certificate here to Cape Town with the amended widowed written on it. So these are things and issues that have come up in the past. Step 3 is that you give the authority to administer. In other words, small estate, 250,000 rand, letters of authority issued. Full estate, 250,000 rand, letters of executor issued. Once the letters of executorship have been issued, now the executor has the power to do with the estate what the law says he has to do. So in other words, now he can close bank accounts. Now he can transfer money. Now he can take a rental. Now he can pay. Now he can do all of these things. Now he can wind up the estate as well. And now he can do the liquidation and distribution account, which is step number 4. In other words, the liquidation and distribution account is a very simple document. It tells the master exactly what is in the estate, what the executor did, what he didn't do, why he didn't do it, what claims against the estate he upheld, and what claims against the estate he rejected. Now, this is very important. A lot of people don't know this. An incident happened to me, I think it was a year ago, where a friend of mine came to me, an attorney, and he told me that he had an estate where there were 2 wives. And here the 2 wives come in. 2 wives is always a problem. So what happened was, the first wife was made the executor of the estate. Listen. And the second wife, she wasn't. She was just supposed to get her Sharia portion, correct? So what the first wife did was, she made an arrangement with some third party that they were going to put claims against the estate. And the executor has the power to reject or uphold a claim against the estate. That's the power the executor has. That's why you must think very carefully when you make your executor. Right? And so she upheld all the claims to the extent of the value of the estate in favor of these claims. So then she sat with the house and everything afterwards. And the first wife, she got absolutely nothing. Obviously, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is qadir, and He's wonderful with these things. But I'm just saying, it's a very effective story in clarifying why the appointment of, the choosing of your executive is very important. Must be a person who is honest. He doesn't have to be capable, but he'll be honest and trustworthy. That is the criteria. Right? So, anyway, after that, this is all the things that are inside the liquidation distribution account. We've got the fiduciary trust account. So in other words, all the cash monies and things like that must go into a trust account, so that it's not in any one person's account. Right? Share distribution certificate. So in this liquidation distribution certificate, the share distribution certificate is what is given to the heir to say this is how much you got. The importance of the certificate is that if there's a dispute, in other words, someone didn't get what they were supposed to get and they didn't know, and years later they found out that they weren't given their true haqq, they weren't given the right amount, then that share certificate becomes their proof. And they can say, look here, 10 years ago, daddy's inheritance was distributed, I guess, but I was supposed to get X amount, but I only got this. And then it becomes up to the heirs to make that right, because someone got more than they were supposed to. Remember, if it is within your capabilities to make it right, then you will be held accountable by Allah, Rabbul Izzati, to make that right. How do we report the estate? This is this last one. This is the distribution and finalization. So there are 5 steps in all of that. Lots of documents, executorship, administration, the payout, and then finally pay all approved debts and expenses, execute bequests, distribute the inheritance to heirs, provide proof of payments to the master, and the master issues the final discharge. So as you can see, there's a lot of steps before he can actually start paying out the money. And that's the last step. That's why it takes so long. That's why you wait so long for that inheritance to be paid out. It's not because the executor is running away with the money. It's not because they're trying to make things difficult. It's just because this is the process. So the payment of the debts and the payment of the zakah and the payment of the bequests and the payment of the mirath of your inheritance, that only happens at the end. And then once it's done, he sends the distribution account to the master, and the master signs off for everything. If there's an issue If you have an issue, you go to the master. If at any time you cannot get your haqq from the executive, for whatever reason, you go to the master, you complain to the master. Because the master is haqqul guardian over all executives, over all estates. Right? A lot of people don't know this. Many times it ends up that there's fights happen. You didn't do this, it's just a lot of fights. I mean, right now there's an estate with 5 siblings. And the estate was very simple. But what happened was, the father, he didn't execute the will properly. So then it wasn't accepted by the master as a will. It's just a letter. So now the estate has to devolve according to intestate succession. That's what happens. And if there's no will, then the estate devolves according to the law of South Africa. In other words, their common law. Right? And their common law is everyone gets the same thing. Everyone either gets, I think it's either 250,000 rand. Sorry, for the spouse. The spouse either gets 250,000 rand or a child's portion, whichever is greater. So ultimately, if you have, let's say, a wife that you leave behind, a daughter and a son and a mother, no, not a mother, and another son, let's say 4, and you have 1 million rand that you've left behind, they each, according to the common law, will get 250,000 rand. Right? So in this particular matter now, obviously now, there are 3 daughters and 2 sons. In terms of Sharia, the sons are supposed to get Hadd al-Untayayn, right? 2 shares, and the daughters 1 share. But now, in terms of the common law, they all get equal shares. They're all going to get 200,000 rand, essentially. 250, 200,000 rand. Now, I explained this to the daughters, and I'll explain it to you as well. The father, mashallah, he tried. But he fell short there in that he didn't execute the will properly. So inshallah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will forgive him and have mercy on him for that, because it was outside of his control. He thought he was doing the right thing. But I told him, now you as the children, you now know what the right thing is. So now this haqq is upon you. And if you don't make it right, then essentially you will be answerable by Allah. It is on you now. And so now it's a difficult thing, when that money is in your account and you want in need, And so that's why I always say, make the will. It saves a lot of heart, and it doesn't put your children in that difficult position. Because in my experience, everyone always needs the money. Everyone always needs it. At that point in time, when it is paid up, everyone always needs it. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protect us, inshallah. Now, there are certain requirements for a valid will. Right? And I think this is obviously the question on a lot of people's minds now. Where did this put us in this example? Where did he go wrong? What did he not do? And the thing that you need to do is the will needs to be written. That's it. First thing. Then it needs to be signed by you, the testator, and it needs to be signed on every single page of the will. Right? Signed in the presence of 2 witnesses. And those witnesses need to be in your presence as well. And the witnesses cannot be heirs. In other words, if an heir signs your will, they automatically cannot inherit from you. They cannot benefit from that will. I'll say that again. If an heir, if your wife or your son or your daughter signs as a witness to your will, then they cannot inherit from you. Right? So it's very important. They cannot sign the will. It must be someone who cannot benefit at all from your estate. Right? It's very important. Testator, it must be 16 years and mentally capable in order to make a will. So from 16 years onwards, they can make a will already. All pages need to be signed and initialed, and alterations need to be countersigned as well. So if you make any additions or any changes, countersign it as well. One of the questions that usually comes up over here is, I know that, mashallah, we have the mashayikh here, and everyone here is well above 16, mashallah. But there's usually a question that comes up from the youngsters, and they ask, why do I need to make a will? I've got nothing. This is usually the question that they ask. And the story that I usually give them is the story of what happened on the bridge. I think it was Boulders, not on the bridge, sorry, Boulders on that road. There was an accident. And in the accident was a head-on collision. One car was coming from this side and the other from this side, and there was a head-on collision between the two cars. And there was a family in the one car, mother, father, and a son in the back seat. And so when the courts were trying to determine the order of death in order to establish inheritance, or who was going to get what, they determined that the mother and the father died simultaneously, right? But the son, he died afterwards. So the mother and the father, they had wills, right? But the son, he didn't. So for a brief moment, the son was a very wealthy man. I mean, his parents were millionaires. So he had millions, but he didn't have a will. So his estate devolved according to South African law. And that fight is still going on now for that. So that's why I say you're never too young to have a will. And the earlier the better. These are the 11 clauses that you need in a will, but the main clause that you need to have. Even if you have nothing else in your will, but your name and your ID number in there, you should have at least this clause. My estate shall be distributed according to the Islamic law of inheritance as set out in the Quran and Sunnah. Minimum. That's it. Minimum. Alright? One of the questions that usually comes up is executor's fee. How much do you pay the executor? Right? A lot of people shaking their heads there. It's like, it can be quite a bit. It can be quite a bit. So it's regulated by this act over here, Administration of the Estates Act. So any estate over 250,000 rand, right? Remember we got any estate over the 250,000 rand marker, then the executor is allowed to charge up to 3.5%. So they don't have to charge 3.5%. It's up to 3.5%. So you can negotiate with the executor. You can even, in your will, stipulate that the executor must only take 2.5%. You can do that. Obviously, you need to get the executor's permission. First, that okay, I'm going to appoint you as executor, can I? And then he says yes, I'll do it. And then you say, look, but only 2.5%, right? And then and then you put it in your will.
So we can negotiate with you.
You can negotiate with me as well, yes. I was going to do it for free, but no, right, that's bad. And then there's also a 6% on income earned after death, so rental, in other words. So there's many times where what happens is, you have siblings, 5 siblings, right? 2 of the siblings are staying in the house. The other 3 siblings are not staying in the house, right? They want to purchase the house from the father. But during the estate, the winding up of the estate, which takes a year or 2 years or whatever, they are benefiting from the estate.